Hi, the next chapter is called The Bubble Pipe in The Diamond in the Window by Jane Langton. It was the 18th of April. Next day would be the historic 19th, Concord's Great Day. It was on the 19th of April in 1775 that the battle had taken place at the North Bridge, climaxing the chain of events set into motion by Paul Revere and beginning the Revolutionary War. Tomorrow, all the schools and stores would be closed. There would be the usual parade down the mill dam with everyone in uniforms of one sort or another, ending up at the bridge for a patriotic address by the governor of Massachusetts. It was to be an especially great day for Uncle Freddie. He loved the parade. He looked forward to it all year. He had his own Minuteman outfit and his own tricorn hat. And he would march as always between the Concord Independent Battery and the Selectmen. Today he had rummaged among his belongings for his tricorn hat and had set it at a cocky angle on his sandy hair. Now he was sitting out of doors in the April sunshine in the doorway of his hollow tree, blowing bubbles. For a pipe he was using his own corncob pipe, doing terrible soapy things to the inside and sending tobacco-stained bubbles up in the warm air. For the cold had broken at last. The day was as warm as any day in June, and the apple tree had put on a brave show of buds on its few old branches. Edward and Eleanor were quite giddy with the warmth after the long winter. Rashly they ran around with bare feet on the grass that was newly green. They were overjoyed with Uncle Freddie's bubbles. Eddie knew where there was another bubble pipe, and he ran all the way to the tower room to get it. It was the clay pipe that had belonged to Ned and Nora. Then he and Eleanor took turns with the pipe and Uncle Freddie's soap mixture. The bubbles came easily. The soap mixture was just right. Bubbles bounced swiftly off the end of the clay pipe and surged gaily upward. Uncle Freddie blew one high up into the apple tree, and when it fell, it perched right in the middle of Ralph Waldo Emerson's marble forehead, looking like a huge transparent boil or a transcendental idea just bursting out of his noble brow. "The crystal sphere of thought," cried Uncle Freddie, standing up and waving his tricorn hat. Then the bubble popped, leaving a damp ring on Waldo's head like the mark of a wet glass. Eleanor blew long chains of bubbles. She blew Siamese bubble twins joined together. Then, miraculously, she blew a bubble inside a bubble. "Look, Eddie, quick, look," she said. The two bubbles rose for a second, turning gently at different rates of speed, and then they fell swiftly. The inner one nudged the outer one and burst. The single larger bubble, lighter now, rose again. Uncle Freddie stood transfixed and watched it go. It wafted back and forth on invisible currents of air, soared as high as the roof, and then disappeared over the southwest gable. Uncle Freddie's Adam's apple stuck out as he watched it with back-thrown head. "Oh, Waldo," he said, "did you see that? How like your remarks about circles." He stretched up his arm and patted the stony necktie of his old friend. Then he started climbing the tree to try to catch another glimpse of Eleanor's astonishing bubble. "How like a man's life are concentric circles," he ranted as he climbed. "He is imprisoned in the smallest until a new idea breaks him out of it and enlarges his horizon. But that horizon, too, may hem him in until he bursts it, too, with a larger, bolder truth and expands another orbit on the great deep." Uncle Freddie scrambled along one rotting limb, his eyes on the heavens, quoting Waldo. "Nature centers into balls, and her proud ephemerals, fast to surface and outside, scan the profile of the sphere." "Look out, Uncle Freddie," cried Eddie, who had looked up just too late. Uncle Freddie came to the end of a limb and plummeted, still quoting, out of the tree. But his fall was broken. Just at that moment, someone passed under the tree on his way to the back door. It was Mr. Preak. He was bowled over by Uncle Freddy's descending form and laid out at full length on the grass. Uncle Freddy rolled off Mr. Preak's vest in perfect health, only slightly stabbed by the Phi Beta Kappa key on Mr. Preak's watch chain. Edward and Eleanor looked on, horror-struck, but Uncle Freddy went right on with his poem. Knew they what they signified, a new Genesis were here, he said, gallantly helping Mr. Preak to his feet. Mr. Preak was very angry. He was so angry he could hardly speak. First, he had been attacked by a madman. Then he had been grossly insulted and called a new Genesis. A new Genesis? Why, his mother was a Saltonstall. When Mr. Preak finally found his voice, it was to tell Uncle Freddy in no uncertain terms that he had come to forbid him to march in the parade tomorrow, and what was more, that he had now proof that Uncle Freddy was criminally and dangerously insane, as could be testified by these witnesses. Eleanor and Edward dumbly shook their heads. And what was more, that the Hall's house was to be put up for auction on the day after tomorrow. That was Friday, unless $575.97 were paid on the dot. Uncle Freddy looked pale. He studied the insides of his tricorn hat. The dot, he said softly. He looked up again at Mr. Preak. A dot is a very small circle indeed, he said. Then he withdrew shabbily into his hollow tree and pulled the drawstring of his checkered door. But Mr. Preak went on inside the big house and laid it on the line to Aunt Lily, made her thoroughly miserable, and then left, slamming the door and clapping on his hat. His Phi Beta Kappa key had drawn blood from Uncle Freddy, and his words had seared Aunt Lily's soul. Edward had never had any trouble going to sleep. It was just a matter of fixing your pillow so that one shoulder was under it, drawing your knees up to your folded fists, and shutting your eyes. But when 12 o'clock struck, he woke up suddenly and found himself thinking uneasily about Uncle Freddy. Could Mr. Preak really take him away to some asylum for crazy people? And poor Aunt Lily, if only he and Eleanor had been able to find some of the treasures in time to save her house for her. Then she could walk right up to Mr. Preak and scatter rubies and diamonds carelessly in front of him. The day after tomorrow, on the dot, just as Mr. Preak had said. Edward closed his eyes again and imagined himself drawing a large dot on the end of Mr. Preak's nose. He pictured himself picking up a huge ruby and aiming it at the dot and then letting it fly. Eddie's knees were drawn up to his fists, his shoulder was under his pillow, and this pretty thought was dissolving into a dream when suddenly he sat up, pushed back the covers, and rolled his legs over the side of the bed. It wasn't too late yet. There were still 2 days, almost, and the verses were almost all solved. There was the treasure that was too precious to be bought, as perfect and as fair as the crystal sphere of thought. And there was the treasure chest hidden by the eye of the bird, and then that was all. Why shouldn't he alone be able to find them? Eleanor didn't have to take any chances, and he wasn't afraid of that old jack-in-the-box. Silently, Edward padded up the attic stairs and looked at the ladder steps. In the moonlight, they looked inviting, beckoning. Sturdily, he climbed to the top. Solemnly, he walked to Ned's bed, and steadfastly he lay down and pulled up the covers. The moon shone in like a bubble of snow, and the diamond shed a rainbow of round moons across the floor. For a moment, Edward's red lashes fluttered open and shut. Then they closed down for good on his freckled cheeks. And Eddie slept again in the hidden, forbidden chamber, the room from which Ned and Nora had disappeared so finally, so utterly, and so completely, so long ago. Downstairs, Eleanor lay tossing and turning. When the clock struck 1, she sat up wearily, punched her pillow into a different shape, shifted her doll, Joanna, and sank down again on her other side. Then she got up restlessly, feeling cross-grained and grumpy, and stood looking out the window, mumbling to herself. The moon looked to her like a stone-cold, hard-boiled egg, or a hard white bubble, a kind of big white sphere, as perfect and as fair as the crystal sphere of thought. What on earth was the treasure that was too precious to be bought? That was almost the very last of them. Why couldn't she try to find it herself? It was Eddie, not she, who had been hurt in the last dream and come so near to being, of course he should not try it ever again, but she could. Why not? And no one needed to know. Eleanor found her way to the ladder steps and climbed up into the tower room. She had a dreadful shock when she saw Eddie sleeping in Ned's bed. He wasn't supposed to be there. But then, of course, she wasn't supposed to be there either. Oh well, they might as well both be in trouble together. The room seemed filled with a sense of doom. Eleanor lay down and woefully pulled the covers over her head, trying to shut the doom out, and closed her eyes. And the next chapter is A Dream with Bubbles.